Resuming debate, the honourable member for Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'll start by saying that I'll be sharing my time with the honourable member from Miramichi Grand Lake. And it's a pleasure to stand here on behalf of the constituents of Edmonton-Wetaskiwin. That was an interesting exchange we just heard there, where the NDP member took issue with many things that the Liberals are doing that are destroying the economy of our country right now, while at the same time she and her colleagues, every single time they have a chance to vote against this government and go into an election to change the government, they side with the Liberal government every single time, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I just had the opportunity to come back from the constituency where, like many colleagues, we were meeting with constituents. I had 6 constituent roundtables, 2-hour constituent roundtables this last week. Had a chance to interact with dozens of constituents at these roundtables. And Madam Speaker, lots of issues got raised. Interestingly, the number one issue was not the carbon tax at those roundtables. The number one issue, time and time and time again in Edmonton-Wetaskiwin, is how do we get rid of this guy before he destroys the country? That is the way that it's articulated in those roundtables by constituents. How do we get rid of this Liberal Prime Minister before he destroys the economy of Canada? Madam Speaker, I always find it helpful. I'll just mention that a few of the other issues that were raised, carbon tax was definitely the main policy issue that was raised. Housing, runaway deficits, safety in our streets, immigration and the recent challenges with the immigration system. Madam Speaker, of course, healthcare is always raised, especially at a time right now when it's clear that we're going to spend more on interest on the debt that the Liberal government's rang up than we spend on healthcare in this country over the next few years. So, Madam Speaker, there are lots of issues to talk about. I think it's helpful in the context of what we're talking about today, though, to revisit the legacy of economic chaos that is in the DNA of the Liberal Party, the Trudeau legacy. Very important to revisit the Trudeau legacy of the 70s and 80s. A government, a Liberal government that ran up 14 deficits in 15 years in the 70s and 80s. And the result of that time, of course, that was a time of drastic economic experimentation with, at the time, the most left-leaning prime minister that we had ever had. Obviously, definitely beaten by the current government, but at that time it was the most left-leaning government we'd ever had. And they undertook an economic experiment. We saw crises, an energy crisis, we saw an inflation crisis, we saw a housing crisis, we saw a national unity crisis that stretched right to the end of that government in 1984, but interestingly, way beyond the time that that government was in power. Of course, the Mulroney government, the 9 years following that government, I remember when some of these members were new and they would come into the House in 2015, 2016 and talk about the biggest deficits in Canadian history being under the Mulroney government. But what they didn't mention, of course, at that time was that those deficits were entirely interest on Trudeau's debt. So the deficits that they ran, they were largely in balance, in fact, probably a little bit in surplus, but the interest payments on the Trudeau debt caused us to run deficits for many, many years after that. And it was actually the result of that, the bill came due in about the mid-90s, 95 to 97, under a Liberal government, under a Liberal Chrétien Martin government. Some of these members served under that government. The bill came due in 95 to 97 when we saw absolutely dramatic cuts, some of the most significant cuts we'd ever seen to healthcare and social services spending in this country. It's interesting because Liberal members often stand up and they say, what are you going to cut? What are you going to cut when we talk about bringing some sanity to our fiscal situation in this country? But you know who really made significant cuts to spending on things that are important to Canadians? That Liberal government in 2 years, from 95 to 97, cut 32% from healthcare and social services transfers in this country. 32%. Can you imagine a government in 2024 having to cut 32% from healthcare and social services funding, but that's what happened from 95 to 97 because of the absolutely tragic economic legacy of a Trudeau government. And Madam Speaker, here we are again. We're now 8 years into this government, eight deficits in 8 years for this government. I assume we'll have a 9th coming up soon. So 9 deficits in 9 years. That's 23 deficits in 24 years under economic policies of this Prime Minister and Prime Minister Trudeau of the 70s and 80s. 23 deficits in 24 years. We've, under this particular Liberal government, backed up by the NDP, we've doubled our country's debt in this country. And you take a look at the things that could help that. We think about the conversation that we're having today. You know what might help us in terms of our economic situation right now, the chaos that we're seeing economically and otherwise in this country, is perhaps revenues from oil and gas. That might actually help. I took a look at the oil and gas import numbers for 2022, the most recent numbers that we have to date. And this will be astonishing to Canadians who assume that we're, that we have a lot of oil and gas production in Canada, obviously one of the world leaders in terms of our vast resources and the potential that comes with our oil and gas resources. But Madam Speaker, what a lot of people don't realize is that Canada every year imports oil and gas because the policies of this Liberal government have made it impossible to build a pipeline in this country. So instead, mostly to Eastern Canada, we're importing oil and gas. In 2022, we imported $21.5 billion in just crude oil. $21.5 billion in 2022 alone. Madam Speaker, that's up 46% from 2021. 46%. Of course, the Americans are the number one supplier of oil and gas products, crude oil, to Canada. The number 2 and 3 countries are Saudi Arabia and Nigeria, totaling over $5 billion. And that's just crude oil coming into Canada. On refined petroleum products, we're talking about even more, $26.1 billion in 2022 alone, up 55% from 2021. We're importing about $47 billion between the two of those in 2022. That is product that could absolutely be sourced here in Canada. And Madam Speaker, the reason that that situation exists is because we hold Canadian producers, hardworking producers, workers in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador across the country. We hold our own workers, our own producers, to a higher standard than we hold producers in Nigeria and Saudi Arabia. We don't ask producers in Nigeria and Saudi Arabia to account for upstream emissions, for the impact on the environment, for the impact on the social fabric of their countries. It was interesting because about a year ago, we had the minister before committee, and I got a chance to ask him about this, and his response was, well, of course Canada has no ability to hold those countries to account. We're not, their own domestic governments control those types of things. Canada can't walk in and hold them to account, but we definitely hold Canadian producers to account for that. The one thing that we can do is refuse to take oil and gas from countries that don't meet the Canadian standard, the same standard that we apply to Canadian producers. This is the world that this Prime Minister has created in 8 years. You go back 8 years and take a look at the situation that existed 8 years ago, and our leader summed it up very, very well this morning when he spoke. It was a world where we had a balanced budget in 2015. We'd worked hard coming out of the economic slowdown, where the New York Times spoke of Canada having the richest middle class in the world, having just overtaken the Americans after decades. A situation where we didn't have a housing crisis that we have right now. situation. I see that you're marking the end of my time. Madam Speaker, I look forward to speaking some more about these things when we take questions from the other parties. Thank you very much.